Diane from Millhouse Quilts, and we're continuing on in our scrap quilt series, and today's topic is what I call generations. And when I say generations, I'm starting with a parent quilt, and then this time, instead of putting the scraps from the first quilt into my scrap pile, I am making something out of the very same scraps. Sometimes when I get done with the quilt, I look at that pile of fabric and I just want to do something with it. I've coordinated everything, it goes together, and sometimes that pile of leftovers looks big enough to do something else with the same thing. So what we have here is, this is a pattern called Cloud 9, and it's a lot of prints with a constant solid in between them. Very nice and simple. And when this one is made, the solid is sewed with the strip so that all of our scraps had these two fabrics sewed together, whatever the print was with some of the gray that's been used here. The child that was made from those scraps. Now if you remember, we had gray sewed to print. So I took some of those scraps and I cut them all the same width and I just randomly sewed them together. And I have columns here that you can see are the same width of the gray sewed to the prints. I had some of the print left over, so I don't know where I'm going when I start these. They just kind of happen. And this wasn't going to be quite big enough, and I decided I wanted a little more color contrast. So I cut some tiny pieces of some of the prints, and I put some strips in there that are just solid print next to the piece. So I have 2 rows of piece, 2 solid, 2 piece, 2 solid. And then I took chunks of the print at the end and I just randomly put chunks around because these are cut the same size as the big chunks were in the original quilt. I had enough of the gray to bind it in. This often determines, if you get down to the end, it's the borders or the binding lots of times that determine what size you can be. Obviously when you're making a smaller quilt out of the bigger, you can't make the same size or you've gotten way too much fabric to start with. So whatever you make is obviously going to be smaller than the one you started with. And in this case, I had enough gray, and so I probably cut the binding first so that I knew I had enough of that, and then used whatever I had left in here. This quilt is called Pristine, and it's a fun, easy one to piece too. We had an assortment of prints, and then you pick one constant, and the constant is sewed to the side of each print, and then your pieces are cut and then just sewed together. All of the scraps from this quilt have a piece of solid sewed next to a print, and they're all this length. So I analyzed my scraps that were left, and I decided, I love these fabrics, I want to keep them together in something. Let's try to make a table runner. I had some of the pieces, so as you'll see here, here's my solid sewed next to the print, solid print, print, solid print. I had scraps of the prints left over, and I decided to just sew strips of those together and then cut them the same length as my scraps with the solid sewed to the print. So I alternated rows, and these just, whatever size block is, it just happens, however much I need to get that length. When I got this center done, it wasn't quite as big as I wanted I didn't think it was quite usable enough. I wanted it a little bit bigger. And I did have some of this dark left. So I figured out how many strips I would need if I was going to put a border on. And I needed 3 strips. I looked at the piece of blue that I had left, and I divided that width by 3, and that told me what size borders I was going to cut. So it wasn't any kind of a standard size. I couldn't predetermine. I took the piece I had, divided by 3. That's what I had. So I sewed those on, and then I had one other print left that was almost enough to be the binding. So I got as much as I could, and I had to sub in. There's a couple pieces here. I tried to be casual, but there's a couple pieces where I subbed in some of the dark so that it was long enough. So these are some of the things you have to think about when you want to use the same chunk of fabric from a quilt. You don't know before you start always if you have enough, if you don't know where you're going when you start. I didn't have a pattern for this. I was just making it up. So you have to keep winging it as you go along. But I think it's a really fun table runner, and I'm really glad I did it. And now with this one, we have a fun pattern called 3rd Street Neighborhood. Black and whites are just always fun. And mixed with the solids, this was totally cool. So what it is houses with different colored doors. And all of our scraps were black and white. We have straight rectangles. We have some triangles here. So we had assorted scraps left over when this quilt was done. When we were working on this as a store sample, we got started and then we rejected some of the fabrics. So I had a little additional scrap from this, and I took those fabrics plus the original ones, and I just randomly started cutting squares and making half-square triangles. These are the ones we rejected, and we thought they looked too gray after we started instead of black and white. That's why we rejected them. So anyway, I've got half-square triangles and solid squares, and I've just played with throwing in some of the solid colors just to brighten it up. It's just so fun to have those solid colors with the black and white. So I pieced the center. I was looking for a table runner, and then somebody said, it'd be nicer if it was longer. So I thought, all right. So I went back to the solids, and I made inner borders on the two ends, and I decided it's more fun to have more colors than just one. So I pieced those half and half. And then I put one more row of blocks on the end. And I think I maybe did go get the black for the binding, but black is something, I don't count. That doesn't have to be a scrap, because I had all the prints from the beginning to do that one. Now this one has what I call a 3rd generation. Because we rejected some of those first fabrics, I had parts of houses left over. When I pick those triangles off, if I put them down here and put 4 house peaks together, I came up with another mat. So here we have their houses without their roof and just a half-square triangle in the corner. And then I took my scraps of the solid colors and just made a scrappy binding to go around it. So you can keep playing with the same scraps as far as you can go. At some point, at this point now, I am done with these. Now these are going to go into my general scrap pile. But I had a great time making generations before they went to the generals. Happy quilting from Millhouse Quilts.